The air that night carried a damp chill, the kind that made Ontario's early spring feel heavier than it should. It was April 14th, 2007, a Friday, and downtown buzzed with its usual weekend rhythm. Neon lights, bass thumping through club walls, and laughter spilling out of open doors. At 28, James Hamilton had the sort of calm confidence that drew people in. 6'3", a practiced athlete's build, and that unassuming grin that could turn strangers into friends. That night, he wasn't out to chase excitement. He was out to celebrate. His basketball team, a semi-professional squad that played regional tournaments, had just won big, nearly $8,000 in prize money. James's share, folded neatly with a rubber band the way his mother Teresa had taught him, sat tucked inside his front pocket. Never flash cash, never invite trouble, she always said. Around 11 Harcourt p.m., James walked into Pulse nightclub, a place that smelled of sweat, smoke, and cheap cologne. His teammates were already there, laughing too loud, taking shots, and letting the victory wash over them. James leaned against the bar, beer in hand, scanning the crowd more out of habit than interest. He'd never been much of a dancer. He liked watching people more than joining them. That's when she appeared. Dark hair brushing her shoulders, maybe 5'6", jeans and a black top that caught the strobe lights every few seconds. She didn't stand out, not exactly. She was attractive, but in a way that didn't demand attention. Still, when she smiled, James found himself smiling back. Witnesses would later remember seeing them together, her laughing softly, him leaning in to hear her over the music. For almost an hour, they stayed like that, close enough to look familiar, yet too far away for anyone to catch what they were saying. At 1 a.m., James tapped his friend Kevin Moore on the shoulder. "I'm heading out," he shouted over the music. Kevin, half drunk and in the middle of a story, barely looked up. He just nodded and waved. That was the last time anyone saw James Hamilton alive. 2 days passed before anyone noticed he was gone. James was reliable, always at work, always at practice. So when he missed his Saturday shift at the sporting goods store, his manager called twice. No answer. When he skipped Sunday practice, his coach drove to his apartment. The place was silent. By Monday morning, Teresa Hamilton was sitting in the police station, trying to steady her hands as she filled out a missing persons report. Her son wasn't the type to vanish. He called her every Sunday without fail. It was their tradition. When he didn't, she knew something was wrong. The officer taking her report smiled politely, the kind of smile that said, "This happens all the time. A 28-year-old man goes out, meets someone, maybe he just needed space," he said. But Teresa wasn't buying that. Mothers always know when something has snapped in the universe. That afternoon, a patrol officer found James's car behind an abandoned grocery store on the east side of town. The building had been empty for years. Weeds clawed through cracks in the pavement, the windows boarded up. The car doors were unlocked. The keys still hung in the ignition. His wallet sat in the center console, cash untouched. There were no signs of struggle, no fingerprints out of place. It was as if James had stepped out for a moment and simply never come back. Detective Raymond Fisher took the case that same evening. A veteran of nearly 2 decades, Fisher had seen his share of disappearances, most ending badly, some never ending at all. By the time James's file landed on his desk, the crucial 72 hours had already passed. Fisher worked methodically. He started at Pulse. The staff barely remembered anything. The bartender remembered James, quiet, polite, 2 beers the whole night. But not the woman. The bouncer said he saw hundreds of faces that night. None stuck out. The club owner, Vincent Greco, handed over security footage reluctantly. The video was grainy, typical for 2007, flickering images and distorted colors. But there they were, James and the woman, walking toward the exit together. The strange thing was how she moved. She kept her head down, angled away from every camera. Fisher had seen enough surveillance footage in his career to recognize when someone knew they were being watched. He paused the tape at the final frame, the door closing behind them, their faces swallowed by darkness. That was it. Teresa Hamilton didn't stop searching. Every morning before work, she drove through town with flyers in her passenger seat, her son's photo printed in black and white, the words, "Missing, James Hamilton, last seen April 14th. She stopped at gas stations, grocery stores, even stood in parking lots handing them out herself. She organized search parties. Volunteers combed woods, fields, and drainage ditches. They found nothing. Weeks turned to months. The case cooled. The news cycle moved on. Detective Fisher kept the file open longer than most. He'd seen plenty of people disappear, but this case didn't sit right with him. The untouched wallet. The car left behind. The woman who never showed up on any camera again. It felt deliberate, calculated. Sometimes late at night, Fisher would sit at his desk, replaying that footage again and again, until the flickering silhouettes burned behind his eyes. A man and a woman stepping into the night. And then, nothing. For most people, time dulls the ache of loss. For Teresa Hamilton, it only sharpened. By the end of 2007, James's case had officially gone cold. The posters around Ontario had faded from the rain. The ink on her son's face had bled into the paper. Still, every morning before she left for work at the hospital, Teresa would pause by the small table near her front door, the one with James's graduation photo in a silver frame, and whisper the same thing she'd said since April. "I'll find you, baby, I promise." Her co-workers stopped asking questions months ago. They had learned that grief like hers existed in its own world, one where time didn't move forward. Detective Raymond Fisher didn't close James's file lightly. He had followed every lead, traced cell phone records, re-interviewed the club staff, checked bank transactions, passport logs, everything, nothing. James Hamilton had evaporated into the dark Ontario night, but Fisher kept a copy of the file on his desk, even after it was archived. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was guilt. Something about that woman in the footage, the way she moved like she didn't want to exist, stayed in his mind like a splinter. Once a month, he'd reopen the file, hoping something new had come in. It never did. In early 2008, Teresa received the first phone call that twisted her hope into something cruel. A man claimed he'd seen James working at a construction site 2 towns over. She drove there before dawn, trembling hands on the steering wheel. When she arrived, she showed his photo to everyone on site. Nobody recognized him. Later, she got another call. This time, someone said James had been spotted hitchhiking near Toronto. Again, nothing. People mean well, she told herself. They just don't understand how it feels to chase a shadow. Her house began to change. The living room filled with stacks of papers, maps, newspaper clippings, police reports she'd begged copies of. She pinned photos of James to the wall, connecting them with red string like she'd seen detectives do in movies. Her daughter Emily started sleeping over at friends' houses more often. The house felt haunted, not by a ghost, but by the space James used to fill. 2 years later, in 2009, Detective Fisher was promoted and reassigned. James's case was transferred to another investigator, someone younger, more procedural, less sentimental. Before he left, Fisher stopped by Teresa's house to tell her personally. She opened the door, looking smaller than he remembered. Exhaustion carved beneath her eyes. "You're not giving up, are you?" she asked. "No, ma'am," he said, though they both knew he didn't believe it. "The department's just reorganizing caseloads." Teresa nodded, forcing a smile. "You're the only one who ever cared, Detective. Don't forget him." Fisher wanted to tell her he couldn't, that he saw James every night in his dreams, standing in that dark parking lot. But he just tipped his hat and left. As his car pulled away, Teresa stood in the doorway, long after the taillights vanished, clutching James's old basketball hoodie against her chest. Years passed. The flyers came down. The volunteers stopped calling. Even the local paper stopped returning her messages. But Teresa kept searching. In 2012, she joined an online forum for missing persons in Canada. She learned how to file new evidence requests, how to write petitions to reopen investigations, and how to pressure police departments legally. She built a small network of people just like her, parents who lived in limbo. Every few months, she sent new letters to the Ontario PD. "Please re-examine the case of James Hamilton. Something isn't right." Most went unanswered. By 2014, Teresa had developed her own theory. She believed the woman from Pulse nightclub wasn't random. Maybe she knew James. Maybe she'd lured him out intentionally. She spent weeks reviewing the grainy photos she'd begged from Detective Fisher years ago. The woman's face was turned away, but one still frame caught something. A faint tattoo near the back of her neck, just under the hairline. Teresa printed it, circled it in red ink, and kept it on her desk. She started visiting tattoo parlors across Ontario, asking if anyone recognized it. Most shook their heads. Some laughed. One artist said it looked like an old symbol from the 2000s, a custom rose design, maybe done locally. It wasn't much, but it was something. In 2015, Detective Fisher, now retired, received a small package at his doorstep. Inside was an envelope with no return address. He opened it to find a photograph. It showed the same stretch of land where James's car had been found 8 years earlier. In the background, a newly constructed warehouse. On the back, a note written in careful handwriting. The ground remembers. Fisher felt his stomach turn. It could have been a prank, or it could have been something else. He tried to trace the envelope, but there were no fingerprints, no postal marks. He kept the photo anyway, locked in his old case drawer. He called Teresa that night. "Has anyone contacted you recently about James?" "No," she said, startled. "Why?" "Just checking in," he lied. After he hung up, Fisher stared at the photo for a long time. Something deep down told him that the case wasn't over, just buried. By early 2016, the Ontario Police Department launched a cold case review program, reopening unsolved disappearances from the past 20 years. Teresa, who had never stopped writing letters, was among the first to demand her son's case be reviewed. When Fisher learned about it, he returned to the station as a consultant. His first request, the Hamilton file. When the old box landed on his desk, it felt heavier than he remembered, filled not just with paper, but with time and guilt, and the echo of a promise he'd once made to a grieving mother. That night, alone in the records room, he spread everything out, photos, reports, evidence logs. And then he saw it, a detail everyone had missed. The club's old sign in the background of the footage, Pulse, had been replaced just weeks before James disappeared. The construction company listed in the permit was Marrow Development, owned by Vanessa Loran. The name meant nothing to most people, but Fisher remembered it. She was the woman who'd once bartended under a different name at a bar across town. The same woman James's friend had mentioned vaguely when describing the dark-haired girl. It wasn't proof, but it was a thread. And after 9 years of silence, even a thread could feel like salvation. Detective Raymond Fisher sat in the dim glow of his desk lamp, flipping through 9-year-old evidence like it was fresh. Dust rose from the case file, catching the light in tiny golden specks. It was late, too late, but sleep hadn't been a companion of his in years. He stared at the name that had reappeared like a ghost, Marrow Development. The company had been registered under Vanessa Loran Marrow, 33 years old at the time, now in her 40s. He ran the name through the system. No criminal record. Clean tax history. Married once, divorced, lived 3 towns away. But Fisher had a gut, and it was telling him this woman had something to do with James Hamilton. He picked up the phone and called Teresa Hamilton. It was past midnight, but he knew she'd answer. "Mrs. Hamilton, it's Fisher." A breath caught on the other end. "You found something, didn't you?" "Maybe," he said. "I'm not sure yet, but I need you to come in tomorrow. There's a name I want you to see." The next morning, Teresa arrived at the precinct with her usual quiet dignity, clutching a folder of old clippings. She looked at the photo Fisher laid out, a still frame of the woman from Pulse nightclub, her head slightly turned. "This is the best image we have," Fisher said. "But I think her name is Vanessa Loran. Ring any bells?" Teresa leaned in, squinting. "I've seen that tattoo before," she murmured. "I showed it to half the tattoo shops in Ontario." Fisher raised an eyebrow. "And?" "One man said it looked like a custom rose, something done locally. He didn't remember who designed it, though." Fisher nodded slowly. Vanessa Loran owned a development firm, but she also worked as a bartender in her 20s at a place called the Blue Door. That bar closed in 2008. Teresa looked up sharply. "That's where James used to hang out sometimes before Pulse opened. You think they knew each other?" Fisher didn't answer. He didn't have to. The possibility hung heavy in the air. Over the next few weeks, Fisher and the newly formed cold case unit re-examined everything. They digitized the old footage, enhancing it with modern tech. The woman's face came into sharper view, not perfectly, but enough to match to a partial DMV record. It was her, Vanessa Lauren. The problem was she'd changed her name in 2010, now going by Vanessa Marrow, remarried, living in a quiet suburb. She ran a small interior design business and looked like the last person capable of anything dark. Still, Fisher knew better than to trust appearances. He visited her under the guise of a property consultation, an old trick to gauge a reaction. The house was immaculate. White walls, soft music, the faint scent of vanilla candles. Vanessa herself greeted him, graceful, confident, and polite. "Detective Fisher," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're a bit of a legend in this town." He tilted his head. "I didn't realize I was famous." "Oh, everyone remembers the Hamilton case," she said, pouring him coffee. "It was tragic. Poor boy just vanished, didn't he?" Something in the way she said it, too casual, too rehearsed, sent a chill through him. He set his cup down. "You worked at the Blue Door in 2006 and 2007, right?" Her hands stilled, just for a second, barely noticeable. "Yes," she said, smiling again. "Back when I was young and stupid." "You remember James Hamilton?" She took a long sip of coffee before answering. "Handsome, polite. Came by once or twice, maybe. It was a long time ago." Fisher leaned back, pretending to relax. "You ever see him after that?" Her smile froze. "No, detective. I haven't thought about that man in years." When Fisher left, she closed the door slowly and locked it twice. From the street, he watched through the reflection of his rearview mirror as she picked up her phone and made a call. Her lips moved fast, her expression sharp. Whoever she was talking to, it wasn't a friend. Back at the station, Fisher typed up his notes. Subject shows high composure, brief micro-expressions of anxiety. Indicates knowledge or guilt, but he had no evidence, just instinct. That night, he couldn't shake the image of her tattoo. The black rose beneath her hairline. The same one in the photo Teresa had circled years ago. Meanwhile, Teresa had her own encounter. 2 days after Fisher's visit, she found an unmarked envelope taped to her front door. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No words. Just a printed photo. A picture of her standing at James's memorial bench downtown. The message was clear. "Stop looking." Her hands trembled as she dialed Fisher. "They're watching me," she whispered. Fisher arrived within 20 minutes. The paper had no fingerprints, no watermarks. He logged it as evidence, but inside, a knot tightened in his chest. Someone was trying to bury the past. Again. A week later, the cold case unit unearthed something odd. In 2007, during Pulse nightclub's renovation, the contractors had reported a foundation issue on the east side of the lot. The report had been signed by none other than Marrow Development, Vanessa's company. Fisher stared at the document. A construction permit, dated 2 weeks before James disappeared. "Why would a development company handle nightclub repairs?" one officer asked. "They wouldn't," Fisher replied. "Not unless they needed access to something." The realization came slowly, like dawn breaking after a long night. If James's car was found near that abandoned grocery store, and the club had a hidden basement access point during renovation, what if they'd used that site for something darker? Fisher pushed for a warrant, but bureaucracy dragged its feet. So one night he went there himself. The old nightclub was long closed, the sign rusted, the inside stripped bare. He stepped through the broken doorway, flashlight in hand, and followed the old blueprints until he found a sealed hatch under the floorboards. It took a crowbar and an hour of effort before it gave way. The smell hit him first, stale air, rot, something metallic. He shone the light down. There was a small room, concrete walls, old stains, and a single piece of torn fabric lodged between the cracks. He knelt, his heart pounding. It was part of a jacket, a dark grey fabric, just like the one James Hamilton had been wearing the night he vanished. The next morning, police teams arrived. The site was cordoned off, forensics called in. DNA testing was ordered immediately. As Fisher watched from behind the barricade, Teresa arrived, her face pale but determined. "Is it him?" she asked softly. "We don't know yet," he said, "but we're closer than we've ever been." Teresa looked out at the old building, that forgotten grave of noise and memory, and whispered, I told you, James, I'd find you. The Ontario Police Department was rarely quiet, but that morning, a strange silence hung over the building. The kind that comes when people realize they've uncovered something sacred and terrible. Detective Raymond Fisher stood by the evidence lab window, arms folded, watching the technicians work. The fragment of fabric he'd found beneath the nightclub was laid out under glass, illuminated by white light. A young forensic analyst named Carla Evans lifted her gaze. "Preliminary results are in," she said. "It's old, degraded, but the fibers match the jacket James Hamilton was last seen wearing." Fisher didn't move. He just nodded, eyes heavy. "What about DNA?" "We found partial traces. Male, consistent with Hamilton's profile," she said. "We'll confirm with bone comparison, but—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Fisher turned away from the glass. After 9 years, the ground beneath Ontario was finally giving up its secret. By noon, word had spread through the department. The old cold case, the one people whispered about but had long stopped believing in, had cracked open. Captain Miles Gallagher, a man who'd aged twice as fast as his years, called Fisher into his office. "You sure about this?" he asked. "Positive," Fisher said. "The fabric, the residue, the location. It's Hamilton." Gallagher exhaled through his teeth. "Then we go after Vanessa Lauren. Hard." Fisher nodded. But deep down, he knew Vanessa wasn't the only one who'd buried something. They brought Vanessa in that afternoon under the pretext of follow-up questioning. She arrived calm, almost serene. Her blonde hair was tied neatly. She wore a white blouse and no makeup, as if she were walking into a job interview instead of an interrogation. Fisher watched her through the observation window. She sat with her hands folded on the table, expression unreadable. When he entered, she looked up and smiled faintly. "You found something, didn't you?" Fisher pulled a chair and sat opposite her. "We found fabric under the old Pulse nightclub. It matches the jacket James Hamilton wore the night he disappeared." Vanessa's eyes flickered, just once. "And what does that have to do with me?" "You tell me," Fisher said. "You were there. You worked construction through your company's renovation contract. Your boyfriend, Derek Sousa, was on the club's security roster. Coincidence?" For the first time, the mask slipped. Her jaw tightened. "You've been digging." "That's my job." Vanessa looked away, tracing the edge of the metal table with her fingertip. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you the truth." "Try me," Fisher said. She didn't speak for a long moment. The hum of the fluorescent light filled the silence. Finally, she said, "We didn't mean for it to happen." Fisher's pen froze mid-stroke. "James wasn't supposed to die," she continued. "Derek had a plan. Easy money, quick job, no one hurt. He said it'd be simple." Fisher leaned forward. "What kind of plan?" "Drug him. Take the tournament prize money. Leave him alive," she said. Her voice was flat, mechanical, like she was reading from a script she'd memorized long ago. "We'd done it before. 2 other men, different nights. James was just the third." Fisher's pulse kicked up. "You're saying this was premeditated robbery?" Vanessa nodded slowly. "Yes, but Derek mixed something wrong, too much sedative. James, he didn't wake up." Her voice cracked then. The first tremor of emotion since she'd sat down. "Where did you take him?" Fisher asked quietly. She hesitated. "To the car first. We panicked. Drove around all night. Derek said we'd dump him somewhere and make it look like he left town. But I couldn't look at him. He was just a kid." Fisher scribbled notes, though his hand shook slightly. "Where did you bury him, Vanessa?" Her gaze lifted, watery but defiant. "I didn't. Derek did. With help." "Whose help?" "His cousin," she whispered. "Ryan Sousa. He owned land outside town, an old barn and fields. That's where they took him. I stayed in the truck. I couldn't move." When Fisher stepped out of the room, Gallagher was waiting. "She's talking. She's unraveling," Fisher said. "And she's naming names." Gallagher crossed his arms. "Get warrants. For both Derek and Ryan Sousa. If she's telling the truth, we'll find a grave." That night, a small team drove east, away from Ontario, past flickering gas stations and rows of dying cornfields, toward Riverside Township. Ryan Sousa's property sat deep in the backroads, a forgotten patch of land surrounded by rusted fences and overgrown weeds. The barn looked like a skeleton, half collapsed, roof caved in, wooden ribs exposed. Here? One officer asked, glancing at the old map. Yeah, Fisher said. Vanessa said near the tree line, maybe 50 or 60 feet in. They began the search. Floodlights washed over the clearing. Forensic techs marked a grid, measured distances, planted orange flags in soft soil. Then someone shouted, "Detective, you'll want to see this." Fisher jogged over. At the base of a fallen oak, the ground looked disturbed, faint depressions where the earth didn't match the rest. They started digging. It was slow, methodical, reverent work. 3 feet down, the shovel struck something that wasn't stone. A muffled clink. Then another. The technician crouched, brushing away dirt with gloved hands. Bone, a femur first, then ribs, then the unmistakable curve of a human skull. Fisher stood still, the cold air burning his lungs. He swallowed hard. "Mark it. Document everything. No mistakes." By dawn, the remains were fully exhumed, wrapped carefully, labelled, sealed. The medical examiner arrived within hours. Fisher didn't speak for most of the drive back. Gallagher rode beside him, eyes fixed on the horizon. "You think she's telling the full story?" "Not even close," Fisher said. "She's protecting someone. Maybe Derek. Maybe herself." Gallagher nodded slowly. "Well, we'll find out soon enough." Back at the precinct, they processed the evidence. Vanessa was booked formally this time. Second-degree murder, kidnapping, robbery, obstruction. When Fisher informed her of the charges, she didn't fight, didn't even blink. She just whispered, "It was supposed to be an accident." By evening, the DNA results came in and confirmed what they already knew. The bones were James Hamilton's. The official announcement went public the next day. Local headlines screamed, "Missing athlete's remains found after 10 years. 3 arrests imminent." The story spread fast. Reporters swarmed the precinct, families of old victims called in, cold cases got reopened. But for Teresa Hamilton, none of that mattered. She sat in Fisher's office, hands trembling around a cup of untouched coffee, as he told her the news. "They found him," he said softly. "We're bringing him home." Teresa didn't cry. She just nodded, eyes glassy with exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on him." Fisher couldn't find words. Because how do you tell a mother that closure and grief weigh the same? He looked down at the photo on his desk, James in his basketball jersey, smiling bright, frozen in time, and thought, justice doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it just feels like the end of hope. The rain hadn't stopped in 2 days. It drummed against the station's metal roof like a metronome for bad memories. Detective Raymond Fisher sat in the small, windowless room that had become his second home. The interrogation room, 9 feet by 11, beige walls, a hum from the overhead light that never quite went away. Across the table sat Derek Sousa, broad-shouldered, mid-30s, face hardened by years of poor choices and cheap liquor. His eyes were bloodshot, but his jaw was locked tight. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight, projecting defiance that felt rehearsed. "You really think I killed that kid?" he said, smirking faintly. "Come on, Fisher. You're reaching." Fisher opened the manila folder in front of him, sliding a photograph across the table. It showed the recovered bones, the remains pulled from the earth, tagged and catalogued. "This," Fisher said quietly, "is what I think." Derek's smirk faltered for half a second, but he caught it and leaned forward. "That could be anybody." "Sure," Fisher replied evenly. "Except the DNA matched James Hamilton, and we have a witness who put you with him that night." Derek's brows twitched. "Witness?" "Vanessa Lauren." The name landed like a slap. He straightened in his chair, eyes narrowing. "She's lying." "Is she?" Fisher said. "Because her story matches everything. The drug, the panic, the burial. She even told us where to dig." Derek's jaw worked. "She's trying to save herself. You really think I'd kill someone over a few $1,000? Fisher didn't blink. "I think you did a lot worse for a lot less." 3 rooms down the hallway, Ryan Sousa sat at another table, his hands trembling. He was smaller than Derek, quieter, the kind of man who'd spent his life being told what to do. His work boots were still muddy from the night they'd taken him in. Detective Miles Gallagher sat across from him, voice low, patient. "Ryan, your cousin's not talking," he said. "But we have enough to put you both away. You want to spend the next 20 years paying for his choices?" Ryan shook his head. You don't understand. I didn't kill anyone. Gallagher nodded. Maybe not, but you buried a body. Ryan flinched. He told me it was an accident. He said if anyone found out, our family would be destroyed. My wife, my kids. Gallagher leaned forward. You think your wife's going to forgive you for hiding a murder? Ryan looked up then, eyes red. He called me that night, he said. Derek said he needed help. I drove out to the edge of town, the old grocery store lot. When I got there, the kid was already dead. His skin was grey, his mouth open. Vanessa was crying. Derek said we had to move fast. Gallagher's pen hovered above his notepad. So you helped him bury the body? Ryan nodded weakly. We drove to my land, dug with shovels, used lime. He said it would break down faster. I didn't even know his name until later. I just wanted it over. Back in Fisher's room, Derek's defiance was cracking. He'd started tapping his foot, faster and faster. Let's talk about pulse, Fisher said. You were working security that night. You knew the camera angles, the blind spots. You clocked out early. Why? I didn't want to be there when things went bad, Derek muttered. Things went bad? Fisher echoed. Derek sighed and leaned forward, elbows on the table. Look, Vanessa had this idea, all right? Said she could make easy cash from guys who thought with their wallets. She'd flirt, get them comfortable. I'd slip something in their drink. We'd take their cash. No one got hurt, but James did. He rubbed his face, eyes tired now. He was bigger than I thought, strong. When he realized something was wrong, he started fighting. I panicked, poured the rest of the sedative in his drink to knock him out. I didn't know it would kill him. Fisher's voice softened, just a little. You left him to die. Derek's hands balled into fists. I didn't know he was dead until we stopped the car. Vanessa was screaming. I checked his pulse. Nothing. You ever see a dead man in the dark, Fisher? It doesn't leave you. Then why not call 911? He laughed bitterly. And say what? Hey, officer, I accidentally drugged some college kid to rob him. I was done either way. So you buried him, Fisher said flatly. Ryan buried him, Derek muttered. I just helped. Same thing. Derek stared at the floor for a long moment, then whispered. We made it look like he walked away. Left his car at that grocery store. Figured they'd just think he took off. But then, his mum, she wouldn't stop. Fisher tilted his head. That bother you? It scared me, Derek said quietly. Every year she was still looking. Every time his name came up, I thought, it's over. I almost turned myself in once. Almost doesn't count. Derek looked up, eyes glassy. You think I don't know that? Later that evening, Fisher stepped into Gallagher's office. They exchanged looks, no words needed. They both confessed, Fisher said finally. Gallagher exhaled. That's it then, 10 years later. Fisher shook his head. No, that's the paperwork, not closure. The next morning, the Ontario courthouse was surrounded by reporters. The story had broken statewide. Cold case cracked after decade of silence. Fisher and Gallagher walked Vanessa through the crowd. She kept her head down, wrists cuffed, her once perfect composure gone. Someone shouted her name. She didn't react. Inside, during processing, she turned to Fisher and said, You think this makes you a hero? He met her gaze. No, but it makes you accountable. She laughed softly. You don't understand. We didn't kill him because we wanted to. We did it because we didn't know how to stop. Fisher's reply was simple. That's what monsters always say. Meanwhile, Ryan Sousa signed his plea deal. Full cooperation. In exchange, reduced sentence. He sat with his lawyer, shaking, tears running down his face as he read the terms. I just want to go home someday, he whispered. You will, Gallagher said, eventually. But you'll never really leave it behind. By evening, Fisher visited Teresa Hamilton again. She opened the door before he could knock, her eyes hollow but steady. You found them? She asked. He nodded. They confessed. Did he suffer? Fisher hesitated, then quietly said, No, it was fast. It wasn't true. But sometimes mercy is a kind of truth. Teresa exhaled shakily, looking past him toward the sky. Then I can finally sleep. Fisher wanted to tell her that sleep wouldn't come easy. Not after 10 years of waking every morning to the same empty chair. But he said nothing. He turned to leave, the rain beginning again, and thought of James Hamilton. the boy who'd wanted nothing more than a chance, and the world that had failed him. Back at his desk, Fisher closed the case file for the final time. On the cover, in black marker, someone had written, "Hamilton James, solved." He stared at that word for a long while. Solved, but deep inside, he knew. This wasn't resolution. It was simply the end of one kind of suffering and the beginning of another. The courthouse in Ontario had seen its share of divorces, petty thefts, and bar fights, but never anything like this. The trial of Vanessa Loran, Derek Sousa, and Ryan Sousa turned the sleepy town into a storm of cameras, reporters, and curiosity. For 10 years, James Hamilton's name had been a ghost whispered in coffee shops and classrooms. Now, it was on every front page again. Inside, the air was thick, not just with the scent of old wood and coffee, but with tension. Detective Raymond Fisher and Captain Miles Gallagher sat quietly behind the prosecution's table, not as witnesses yet, but as watchers. They'd carried this case longer than anyone. At the front, Judge Ellen Marks, stern and grey-haired, took her seat. "State versus Loran, Sousa, and Sousa," she began. "Court is now in session." The gavel fell. History began to unearth itself again. Prosecutor Patricia Hoffman, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a calm fury in her tone, rose first. She turned toward the jury. 10 years ago, she began, a young man named James Hamilton walked into Pulse nightclub with friends. He never walked out. For a decade, his mother, Teresa Hamilton, begged for answers. What you'll see in this courtroom, ladies and gentlemen, are not mistakes. You'll see choices. Calculated, deliberate, merciless choices. Her words landed like stones dropped in water. She lifted a file. The defendants, Vanessa Loran, Derek Sousa, and Ryan Sousa, hid behind silence. They let a family suffer so they could protect themselves. But the truth has a way of rising, even through dirt. When she sat, even the reporters had stopped typing. The defense took turns. Gregory Walsh, Vanessa's court-appointed attorney, stood nervously, tugging at his tie. "My client," he said, voice too soft for the room, "is not the monster the prosecution paints her as. She's a broken woman who fell under the control of an abusive partner, Derek Sousa. For years he manipulated her, used her, and made her complicit in acts she never wanted. Her confession wasn't out of guilt alone, but of courage." He pointed at Vanessa, sitting motionless beside him. Her face was pale, expression unreadable. "She came forward voluntarily," Walsh continued. "Without her, James Hamilton's body might still be buried, and justice would still be buried with him." Across the aisle, Samuel Rivera, Derek's private lawyer, adjusted his cufflinks before standing. His tone was colder. "My client admits mistakes," he said, "but he's not a murderer. What happened was an accident, an overdose, not an execution. Derek panicked. He made bad decisions, yes, but none of them were premeditated." He leaned slightly toward the jury. "If panic and fear were crimes worthy of life sentences, we'd all be in prison." Finally, Claire Doyle, the youngest of the 3 defense lawyers, rose on behalf of Ryan Sousa. Her voice trembled only slightly. Ryan was 21 when this happened. He was scared, confused, and dragged into something he didn't understand. He didn't kill anyone. He didn't plan anything. But he has lived with guilt every single day since. He confessed fully, cooperated, and gave up his family to tell the truth. Don't let him carry the same punishment as those who started this. Day 2. Witnesses took the stand. The courtroom listened to the forensic team describe the burial site. The tarp, the lime, the bones half swallowed by tree roots. Photos flashed on the projector. The dark soil, the fragments of James's clothing, the cracked watch stopped forever at 2 a.m. Several jurors flinched. Teresa Hamilton didn't. She sat in the front row, hands folded, her gaze unbroken. When the medical examiner, Dr. Sarah Lamont, took the stand, her voice was clinical, steady. "Cause of death," she said, "was respiratory failure caused by a lethal combination of sedatives and alcohol." Hoffman asked, "Could the dose have been accidental?" Dr. Lamont didn't hesitate. "No. The concentration found in Mr. Hamilton's system was approximately 4 times the standard sedative threshold. Someone wanted him unconscious, not just impaired." Rivera frowned, scribbling notes. Then came Vanessa's confession, played aloud for the court. Her recorded voice, quiet, trembling, but unmistakably clear, filled the room. "We just wanted the money. He wasn't supposed to die," the tape continued. Vanessa described James's final moments, Derek's panic, Ryan's silence. She spoke of guilt that never faded, of trying to erase herself under a new name, of nightmares that chased her for years. Teresa closed her eyes, and for the first time, a tear slipped down her cheek. Day 5. Ryan Sousa took the stand. He looked thinner, older than his years, eyes rimmed red. "I should have called the police," he said, voice breaking. "I should have stopped them. But I was scared. Derek told me if I said a word, he'd bury me next to him. I believed him." Hoffman leaned forward. "Did you help move the body, Ryan?" He nodded. "Yes." "Did you dig the grave?" "Yes." "Did you know James was dead?" He hesitated. "I did. I kept telling myself maybe he'd wake up, but he didn't." His voice cracked. "I hear him breathing in my dreams." The way he stopped. Even Derek's expression faltered for a moment. Day 8. Derek himself finally took the stand. He wore a suit that didn't fit, his wrists still faintly bruised from the cuffs. His tone was defiant. "I never planned to kill anyone," he told the jury. "It was supposed to be quick. Take the money, leave him somewhere safe." Hoffman stepped closer. "Safe? You left him in your truck, dead, and buried him like garbage. That's your idea of safe?" Derek clenched his jaw. "You don't know what it's like. The panic, the fear." "I know what he felt," Hoffman interrupted, slamming a photo onto the table, James's smiling face in his basketball jersey. "He was 28. He trusted you. You fed him poison and left him in the dark." The courtroom fell silent except for the quiet hum of the lights. Day 10. The closing arguments began. Hoffman's final words to the jury were steady but heavy. "Justice isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility. James Hamilton's life ended because 3 people thought their fear mattered more than his breath. Don't let them walk away from that." Then it was over. The jury left. Hours passed, endless heavy hours. When they returned, the verdicts came one by one. Vanessa Lauren, guilty on all counts. Derek Sousa, guilty on all counts. Ryan Sousa, guilty of accessory and obstruction with leniency for cooperation. The judge read the sentences. Vanessa, 25 years with parole possible after 20. Derek, 30 years, no parole. Ryan, 8 years, time served credited. Vanessa lowered her head, hands trembling. Derek stared blankly ahead. Ryan simply cried. Teresa Hamilton rose from her seat and walked out without a word. Outside, the wind had turned cold. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Detective Fisher watched as Teresa stepped into the sunlight, clutching a small framed photo of her son. "Is it over?" a reporter asked her. She looked at them, tired, distant, and said softly, "No, it's just quieter now." Autumn came early to Ontario the year the trial ended. The air turned crisp, the maples along River Street burned red, and for the first time in a decade, the Hamilton case file was moved from the active cabinet to the archives. A single word was stamped across its spine in black ink. Closed. Detective Raymond Fisher stood in the evidence room, looking at the boxes one last time. The photographs, the audio discs, the soil samples from the burial site. 10 years of work compressed into cardboard and paper. He thought of James's mother, of the way she'd gripped the courtroom bench as the verdicts were read. Justice had arrived, but it had come too late to feel like victory. Vanessa Lauren adjusted to prison life with quiet resignation. She was assigned to the textile unit, where she spent her days sewing uniforms for people she would never meet. She kept to herself, spoke little, and never joined the others in gossip or games. The guards said she was polite, almost gentle, but distant. At night, she wrote in a small notebook the warden allowed her to keep. No one knew what she wrote. Maybe confessions, maybe letters she never mailed. The psychiatrists described her as functionally remorseful, a phrase that meant she felt guilt, but too late for it to matter. Every spring, when sunlight slipped through the narrow cell window, she would close her eyes and imagine Riverside, the quiet rental house, the sound of gravel under tires, the garden she never finished planting. Freedom had become something abstract, like a dream she could describe but not feel. In 2038, after serving 20 years, she faced the parole board. She looked older, her hair streaked silver, her hands marked with age. The board granted parole on the condition of lifelong supervision. She left prison with a paper bag of belongings and no one waiting outside. Within a month, she vanished into another small town under another name. For some people, punishment never ends. It only changes shape. Derek Sousa did not last that long. He spent his years in a maximum security facility 2 states away, notorious for its violence. The first year, he fought constantly. By the 5th, his body began to fail. Old injuries, untreated infections, a slow decay. He refused interviews, refused visitors, even his sister. When news broke in 2029 that he'd been found dead in his cell from heart failure, no one claimed his remains. The prison buried him in an unmarked plot among hundreds of others. The warden signed the papers and closed the file. Detective Fisher read the notice in the newspaper. He felt nothing. Not triumph, not pity, just the faint relief that a noise had stopped. Ryan Sousa walked out of prison in early 2023. The world had moved on without him. He was 35 now, grey at the temples, eyes that never stayed still for long. His wife had remarried. His children barely remembered his face. He changed his name, moved 3 states east, and found work in construction again. He kept his head down, avoided bars, avoided friends. But sometimes, when a truck backfired, he'd flinch as if hearing a shovel hit frozen earth. He sent one letter to Teresa Hamilton after his release. It was only 3 lines long. "I can't undo what I did, but I think about him every day. I'm sorry. Ryan." She never wrote back. Still, he kept a copy of the letter folded in his wallet until the paper wore thin. Teresa Hamilton lived quietly after the sentencing. Her house remained the same. White curtains, old piano, James's trophies lined on the shelf. She visited his grave every Sunday with fresh flowers, speaking softly to the headstone as if her son might still be listening. For years, she was a fixture in the town. Gentle, polite, a little distant. People lowered their voices when she passed by. Some said she'd forgiven the killers, others said she never could. The truth lay somewhere in between. In 2027, at the age of 71, Teresa's heart finally failed while she slept. The neighbours found her the next morning, the house perfectly tidy, a vase of lilies on the table. She was buried beside James under the same oak that shaded his grave. The headstone read, "Teresa Hamilton, something to say to unanswered." She waited and he came home. Fisher attended the funeral. There were fewer than a dozen mourners, mostly old friends and a few officers. As the casket lowered, the detective felt the wind shift through the trees. Quiet, steady, final. The town of Ontario changed in small ways after that. Pulse nightclub was long gone, replaced by a medical complex that shone bright at night with sterile light. No one mentioned what used to stand there, though everyone knew. Parents still told their children not to talk to strangers, not to trust easily. The old fear had settled into the town's bones. The police department used the Hamilton case in training sessions for new detectives. They called it the Decade Case, an example of perseverance, patience, and what guilt can hide. Fisher gave the presentation once every year. He never dramatized it. He simply told the facts, then finished with the same line each time. "Justice is never clean, it just stops the bleeding." By then, his hair was white, his voice quieter, but he still carried James's photo in the back of his notebook, a reminder of why he joined the force in the first place. Years drifted. People forgot dates but remembered the feeling. Children who'd once seen the case on television grew up, married, had families of their own. To them, James Hamilton was just a story adults whispered when the nights got too still. But somewhere in a low-security halfway house 2 states away, Vanessa Lauren read about Teresa's death in a local newsletter. She folded the clipping, pressed it against her chest, and whispered a prayer she hadn't spoken in decades. She'd outlived everyone connected to that night, except Ryan. One evening, she wrote a final entry in her notebook. If forgiveness exists, it must live somewhere beyond memory. I don't expect to find it, but I hope James did. The next morning, she was gone. Some said she left for another town. Others believed she walked into the river that bordered the facility grounds. The file simply notes, parolee unaccounted for. In 2038, Detective Fisher retired. On his last day, he returned to the archives, pulled out the Hamilton case box, and opened it. The smell of old paper and dust rose around him. He found a photograph of James on the basketball court, mid-jump, smiling, alive. He slipped the photo into his coat pocket and left the station without saying goodbye. The box stayed behind, returned to its shelf, waiting for time to erase the edges of every label. Years later, visitors to the small cemetery on Hillcrest Road still notice the two graves side by side under the oak. Sometimes they see fresh flowers there, though no one knows who leaves them. The petals are always blue, James's old team colour, and when the wind moves through the branches, it carries the faint echo of a whistle, like the sound of a basketball dropping clean through a net. Ontario remains quiet now, but beneath its calm surface lies the story of a mother, a son, and the people who tried too late to do right. Because the truth, once buried, never really dies. It just waits for someone to dig it up again.